I'm Aaron Sagers, and this is Talking Strange.
Aloha, spooky nerds, and welcome to Talking Strange, a paranormal pop culture show with the Den of Geek network, where we discuss the entertainment of the unexplained. I am your host, Aaron Sagers, a journalist, author, researcher of all things weird, and currently I can be seen on Travel Channel and Discovery Plus's Paranormal Caught On Camera. Now, if you didn't know, 2022 is the 125th anniversary of Bram Stoker's Dracula. In fact, on May 26, 1897, Irish author Bram Stoker published one of the most important and well-known pieces of Gothic fiction, introduced one of the most well-known fictional characters in the form of Count Dracula, and I honestly can never say it without saying it like Count Dracula. You know, thank you, Bela Lugosi. And I don't think you can find a corner of this globe where people do not have an awareness of Dracula. And it set the template, set the stage for all things vampires in pop culture. Yes, vampires had existed before within fiction, but nothing had the worldwide impact of Dracula. Now, with that said, this is also the 100th anniversary of Nosferatu, which is the first film adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula, but not really a licensed or legal adaptation. And that is part of the conversation we're going to be having here today. So without further ado, let me bring in this gentleman. He is the great-grandnephew of Bram Stoker. He's the international best-selling co-author of Dracula the Undead that came out in 2009, which is the official Stoker family endorsed sequel to Dracula. He is also the co-editor of The Lost Journal of Bram Stoker, The Dublin Years, that came out in 2012. And in 2018, he co-authored with J.D. Barker a prequel to Dracula called Dracula. And that was UK's number one best-selling hardcore novel in horror and supernatural in 2018, and a top five finalist for the Horror Writers Association for the Bram Stoker Award for Superior Achievement in a Novel. He is a hell of a guy. I'm lucky to call him a friend, and we also, a handful of years ago, traveled to Romania and toured around Transylvania and the surrounding areas while trying to make a TV show. Story of my life. So without further ado, let me bring him in, Mr. Dacre Stoker. Hey, Dacre.
Hey, Aaron, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, man. Thank you for joining me today. I know you're a busy guy. You're always busy because you're not just the ambassador for the Stoker family. You still have a regular job. A job totally separated from fangs and blood and horror, right?
Well, yeah, that's true. You know, my sporting background has still stayed with me. I do coach the number one player in the world in a very strange game, very appropriate for your show. Strange game of court tennis. So that keeps me busy when I'm not, in the books, in the libraries, in the archives, looking for really cool things, or heading off with you to Transylvania to the deep dark bowels of nowhere, hearing wolves howl and so on. So yeah, always looking for cool adventures. But as you mentioned at the top of your show, the 125th anniversary of Dracula, it's a big year. A lot of speaking engagements. A lot of writing still to be done. There are things that are just ongoing, things that I'm finding. So very cool to share that with some of your listeners today.
Yeah. And, it's funny to me, and pardon some gentle ribbing from me. But when people hear the name Dacre and when people hear the name Stoker, they might think that the guy that is about to appear on screen is going to be clad all in black and looking a certain way, a certain spooky way. Yes, maybe even with some fangs. And so this is we distribute this as video, also as a podcast. But I'm sure you probably have had that assumption greet you in the past with other interviews.
Well, yeah, I mean, the first thing is, that Dacre, that's a made up name, right? It's going to try to get people to buy the Dracula book, but it's not. I mean, that's actually the name I was christened, and actually, my parents met Dacre Stoker on their honeymoon, and Dacre Stoker came from Bram's father's brother, named a child Dacre Stoker, who turned out to be a very interesting guy, and he was an Irishman in the British Navy on loan to the Australian Navy, and he was a captain of a submarine in World War I that took a sub up Gallipoli during the horrible landing of Gallipoli. So there's some interesting people in the family. I was named after one. There is actually a Bram Stoker, and one of my cousins named their children after Uncle Bram. So yeah, a lot to live up to, and an interesting name. But I tend to I think I feel better with the sort of maybe the theater manager look rather than the creation of the theater manager himself.
Well, yeah, Bram himself was just a gentlemanly type, and he knew how to grow a good beard, which I can respect.
You can. I haven't tried it. My son, though, funny enough, Aaron, he's got a nice beard like yours, and there's a strange resemblance to Bram in his beard, that kind of reddish hair, that Irish look.
Yeah.
So I've tried it. It came out miserably, so just got rid of that and moved on.
Well, it's the Stoker family. Correct me if I'm wrong. There wasn't a whole lot of no one was really bearing the torch before you. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Bram was one of 7 children, and of those 7, only 3 had offspring. Of course, Bram did. He had a son, but that son had a daughter, so then the name of Stoker is gone. In World War II, both of her husbands died, so that name was really gone, but there are some children still alive. But they were chartered accountants, not really interested in carrying the torch or continuing the literature, but they do, every now and then, they find something in a box, like they're the ones that actually found the lost journal in their attic and said, Dacre, you might want to do something with this. So Elizabeth Miller and I published it. And that was a cool find. And they've made things available to archives. They sold things to different universities, so they're available for people. And they've kept some pretty cool stuff. Bram's watch fob and his watch, the seal, the druid head seal that Bram actually sealed all his letters with. They still have some of the trophies that Bram won at Trinity College for sports. So those are some family heirlooms they're just not going to get rid of. And when I was over there a few years ago, doing some speaking engagements, I visited the private library and found some really cool books, like signed books by Walt Whitman to Bram, to Mark Twain to Bram. Some of these familiar things. Pamela Coleman Smith, who were friends of Bram when he was living and working as a theater manager. He had some cool stuff that Florence did not sell. That's interesting enough too, Aaron. I know we've chatted about sort of you are what you read.
Mm-hmm.
And those are things where I get little subtle hints about Bram as I try to fill out an idea what kind of person he was. Is what were the books that Bram's wife sold when he died, and what do they tell me? And one of the things, just to share with you, because I can't remember if I have already, but it's very appropriate for this show on the paranormal. Bram actually had some books about the paranormal in the day, Second Sight, and he actually reviewed a book of Second Sight in the Highlands and Islands of Scotland. And that's been recently discovered, that Bram actually reviewed one of those books. And then I found an article in a Dundee, Scotland newspaper that Bram is actually recounting some of his own, let's just say, connections or encounters with Second Sight. So
fascinating.
It was fascinating. And, you think of the occult during the time when Bram was writing Dracula. This was not people, on Friday the 13th sacrificing a black cat. This was really interesting, looking into the unknown and looking deeper into what organized religion tells people about the afterlife and the interest in spiritualism. And we've got records of Bram and Twain sitting down chatting about this stuff. So it's really interesting that it was in the forefront of some of the great thinkers of the time. And Bram managed to slide it into Dracula in a number of places, with mesmerism and mind control and that kind of cool stuff.
Yeah, I've thought about the fact that he did liaise with other icons of the time. You mentioned Mark Twain. You mentioned Walt Whitman. He knew Arthur Conan Doyle, correct?
Yes,
And they interacted.
absolutely. This was one of the neat relationships that I've uncovered. Bram did some newspaper articles on people to make money on the side. One was a very extensive article about Conan Doyle as he was preparing to get married. Him and Florence were invited to his wedding, but Bram also helped Conan Doyle adapt one of his short stories to a stage play where Henry Irving played the lead in Waterloo. And then, of course, something that you and I have discussed at some of the conventions together, this really neat letter that Conan Doyle wrote to Bram congratulating him on the story Dracula. And he actually wrote, it's one of the most interesting stories of diablerie in recent memory, which obviously is all about the devil. So here's a subtle look at the two of these guys that are interested in the impact on the occult and the devil. And of course, Dracula was Bram's devil incarnate. This was his being. Henry Irving on stage playing Mephistopheles and all this cool stuff. He's uncovered in the London Library about the devil and what kind of grip that had on people, the interest it had on people, while religion at the time was kind of losing its power over the masses.
When you look at a character like Van Helsing, at the time that Bram was writing Dracula, and then when it came out, and even for years after it was published, this was still a time of spiritualism. Arthur Conan Doyle being a leader in the spiritualist movement, and it was these characters. They were characters, the real life spiritualists, and the people that were forming the psychical societies were learned gentlemen, people who would dress up not in black suits or not in black t-shirts looking for ghosts, but instead they would be dressed up in nice 3-piece suits and things like that. Van Helsing very much fits that model. Bram himself would have fit in quite well with these characters. So it is interesting that he tapped into this spiritualist movement, maybe without even intending to do so. What were some of the things that in this Second Sight review that he alluded to that he may have himself experienced?
Well, there was two particular cases which was really interesting. One, he mentioned that he went to a home in Edinburgh. I don't know if it was it sounded like a social visit, and he heard the mother talking to the sort of 2 or 3 year old child, maybe it was 3 or 4 year old child, saying, "Oh, Tommy's not playing with me. Why is that? Why is not? He's going to die." And it's like, what? And so don't be silly. So Bram, talking to the mother, said, "Well, the daughter has noticed that her brother's going to die." And there was nothing wrong. I mean, obviously they didn't have modern medicine. I don't know if it took the temperature, but the kid was just fine. 2 days later, the child was found dead in its crib.
Well,
so this little child, Bram, experienced this going on. The second one was more firsthand, and it is Bram in Cruden Bay. Now, we know my friend Mike Shepard wrote books about Bram. I've did a foreword for When Brave Men Shudder. We know Bram went to Cruden Bay 13 times, 12 of them in the Cruden Bay Whinnyfold area, and the Earl of Errol was the guy that owned the big castle. Incidentally, that's the castle you and I have chatted about, where the interior with the octagonal room is this exact same layout that Bram used in Castle Dracula. So
right.
he must have been in there. But further to this proof is in this article, he mentions going bird hunting. They all go out into the fields. I don't know if it's grouse or pheasant or whatever it is, and they all have their loaders, their gillies and their loaders to do all the menial work. And Bram said to the gilly, "Oh, the Lord's looking good, isn't he?" And the gilly said, "Oh no, the sheet is on his chest," which is means the sheet's about to cover his head.
Sure.
He goes, "Don't be silly. He looks just fine." And then that was it. He went back the next year to Cruden Bay, and he was invited again to go shooting. And he was given a different loader, and he said, "No, I'd like that one, please," because that was the guy he used the year before. And he took the opportunity to say, "You see, young man, you weren't right." He said, "The air looks just fine, and he has been fine for a year." He goes, No. The sheet is higher." he goes, what? Are you silly, man? And he goes, no, you'll see. 2 days later, a brain aneurysm killed the arrow. So here is an example that Bram had firsthand from one of these Scottish Highlanders who over a period of a year had this feeling and called it. And to sort of confirm it, Bram followed up by saying the man's doctor, the Earl's doctor, had no inclination whatsoever, had no medical reports to give him an idea that the Earl had anything wrong with his brain. Obviously, even today, you can't usually find a brain aneurysm without really sophisticated scanning. But that loader of the gun called it, that he was going to die.
Would you go so far as to say that Bram was a believer in the occult, the supernatural?
I would go so far as to say, is number one, he was very interested in it and he had a very open mind. There's nothing that I've found, Aaron, and he was very measured about saying if I believe in it or not. And I think it's because, as you just said a few moments ago, people who were interested in practicing these thoughts could not always be completely open about them because they might be a little bit shunned in society. So they wore their suits and everything. But if you look into things like the Hellfire Club, the Golden Dawn, they were held behind closed doors. There was also, and JD Barker and I researched this, when you went to a Hellfire Club meeting, it was secret to get in and nobody could see you leaving. The curtains were down in the carriage, secret entrance, secret exit. So I think Bram, being an upstanding theater manager, had to hold a lot of these thoughts inside in public so he wouldn't be jeopardizing his reputation or that of Henry Irving. Bram was a member of the Freemasons. We know that for sure. He did attend some meetings of the Order of Odd Fellows, which was a part of the Golden Dawn.
Yeah.
And I do believe, long-winded answer, even though he didn't say it, I think he believed in some of these things. I think and again, open-minded enough, great famous quote in Dracula, there are mysteries which men may only guess at, which age by age they may solve only in part. And I think, Aaron, that's the stuff he's talking about. I think he's respected. He respects enough of modern science, but he also respected the unknown and things that couldn't be proven by modern science.
Well, and he was raised, he's a young Irish boy. It's a culture steeped in folklore, steeped in interest, in the supernatural. This, and you've looked into this. You've looked into some of his interest in folklore and where he was hearing tales as a boy, correct?
Well, absolutely. The first 7 years of Bram's life, he was bedridden with some sort of mysterious illness. My best theory is it was some sort of respiratory allergies, because he did grow out of it without scarring his cardiovascular system, and he was able to go on to become a champion athlete. So whatever it was, he grew out of it. But for 7 years, he was essentially homeschooled by nanny and mom by telling him stories. And I've researched those stories. One I know in particular that actually Bram asked his mother to write down, called the Charlotte Stoker cholera story, where she experienced firsthand the cholera epidemic of 1832, where people were misdiagnosed and buried prematurely and crawled out of the graves. That's actually one of their neighbors did that. So even though that's not superstition, that's real. That's more horrendous than superstition. But there was also the Dergdu and the Arbrecht and all kinds of other really interesting Irish superstition and folklore, that fairies and banshees, changelings, that were all supernatural and superstitious things, that kind of were obviously cautionary tales to control, people's behavior and actions and so on. But it was like, don't mess with this, the unknown, this will get you, this will come back to haunt you. So he was, at a young age, that was ingrained upon him. So no wonder his fertile sense of imagination. Later on, when he started reading about it, Aaron, started going to meetings with Freemasons, it all sort of came together in him in a very mature way as he could develop a serious outlook on life, but still with a very young, dark, macabre sense of imagination from the beginning.
Have you developed any ideas about, with the Count, this is a character, as I mentioned before, there's obviously vampires existed in folklore. We have Mercy Brown the vampire of I guess Rhode Island, I think.
Yeah.
And so there's the folkloric vampires, and then within fiction, vampires had already existed, but he introduced ideas such as bats were already affiliated somewhat with vampires, but transforming into a bat that was a Stoker flourish. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, things like hatred of garlic, that was
That's a
Stoker's
Stoker.
introduction.
Yeah.
Sunlight weakening his powers, not killing him, not in the
Good
book.
call. That's a good point, because I know we're going to talk Nosferatu
Yeah.
in a moment. So don't get those things mixed up.
No.
Yeah,
In the
you're
book,
right.
he
Yeah.
not destroyed by sunlight. But did have you developed any ideas about where he came up with certain ideas, such as that, if those were just creative flourishes adding to the folklore, or if some of those things might have been rooted in his own fairy tales and experiences and stories that were passed along to him?
Yeah, it's a great question. And to me, from what I've found, it's so much of Bram's life and Dracula are sort of mergers. It's the perfect storm. It's Bram's personal experiences that we've chatted about as a young boy, his upbringing in Ireland, which is steeped in all this when he gets a little bit older, his research in the Marsh's Library, his connections and literary connections with Oscar Wilde's mother, who had encouraged him and other literati to write and express themselves when Bram's father was not, who wanted him just to be a civil servant. So there was that part of Bram that was like dying to become the writer. He was also an amateur artist and a founding member of the Dublin Painting and Sketching Club. So he was beginning to, as a university student, express himself artistically as well as in a literary form. And then there came the theater. You see, the theater was Bram's first love, and he got the job to go off to London to work for Henry Irving. And lo and behold, all of this again begins to take form. Remember, this is this merger of many things. Henry Irving playing the role of Mephistopheles, the devil in the play Faust, for 27 years. And then we find he goes off to the London Library and does his research, and an incredible, interesting piece of digging. Philip Spedding, who was the head of fundraising at the London Library, found all these books of spiritualism, mesmerism, the occult, where respected medical doctors, respected priest is writing about the other world, forces of supernatural power, not just kind of the day whack jobs. These were, really respected people. And Bram's reading that, and we know he reads it because, in a naughty sort of way, Bram actually made marks in the margins of these books, underlining things like vampirism and volcanoes were homes of the devil. So it all sort of came together for Bram, little bits and pieces, almost like, as I said, like a big stew, a good Irish stew with a little bit of Emily Gerard, Transylvanian superstitions. Here's a Scottish lady that moved to Transylvania, and she wrote a booklet that had information on Transylvania superstition with the very tropes that you mentioned, Aaron, in the beginning of your question. How did Bram get the idea of the stake through the heart, or cutting the head off and putting in garlic? So Gerard was interested in Scottish superstitions, and she moved to Transylvania and wrote a book called Land Beyond the Forest, with an essay called Transylvanian Superstitions. It all just came together for Bram with these books and his personal experience, and look what we end up with 125 years later.
I guess every good writer is something of a sponge as far as seeing something, absorbing it, and then turning it into their own creation. But it does seem like Bram was especially good at that. And even down to, I feel like people who really love Dracula know the importance of Whitby in the Bram Stoker story. But do you think that in the mainstream, enough people realize that Whitby had such a profound impact on Bram?
Probably not, because unless you're aware of Bram's 125 pages of notes that live in the Rosenbach Museum in Philadelphia, and I highly recommend, if you're ever in Philly, make an appointment, that you notice that Bram started his notes and his thinking process to hold the whole story in Austria, or the province of Styria. And you mentioned at the top of your show other Dracula stories. Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu set Carmilla in Styria. And so Bram was following suit, I think probably because his fellow Irishman wrote the story a number of years before him and already set the tone that this is a believable place for vampires. So he starts in Styria. And he also decides to call his count Wampir, which is Austrian for vampire. But then we know by the dates and the notes, and we know that he only went to Whitby once because, funnily enough, in Whitby, they keep all the names of the visitors in the newspaper. They log like a guest book. So we know when Bram and his wife and son went to Whitby, where they stayed. Incidentally, they stayed on Royal Crescent, the exact same house or the exact same street that Bram has Lucy and Mina stay in. But to get back to this, the importance of Whitby is, if he didn't take this one holiday there, we probably would have had, number one, a very different name and a very different location for the action. But he was so taken by this wonderful Gothic atmosphere, and also the sense of the realism that he could get in Whitby as he visited with the Coast Guard and the rescue crews, who gave him information from their book, The Wrecks of Whitby's, of this strange Russian schooner that arrived under full sail with none of the crew about and somehow landed on the beach, and a big black dog jumps out. So Bram uses that as, of course, the arrival of the Count, the supernatural storm, but he's got his supernatural and he's got his reality all blended in together. So Whitby, Aaron, is proud to say, we're where Dracula was conceived, and chapter 6, 7, and 8 were born. And you got to come and see it to believe it, because it's all right there. People walk through the town with their copy of Dracula kind of walking the steps of Mina as she runs through town and sees the graveyard and the headstones that Bram takes the names off of. So very cool place. That's one of the spots that I'm going to be going back on this tour in May, to kind of let people feel it and try to get the vibe that Bram did to write, his chapters there.
Yeah, I might have to join you. I still haven't been to Whitby, and I really, it's a location that I don't know how I have not made it over there yet. Considering my love and knowledge of the book, but just the fact that this so inspired Bram, I need to make my way over there.
Listen, if we have suffered through Transylvania together, with some parts were very comfortable, no doubt, but some weren't so comfortable, then you got to come to Whitby with me, and then even we go up the coast to Cruden Bay, where Bram actually wrote the story. So you got to put that on someday. Bring some of your listeners. Let's go do it together.
There's a lot of stories that emerged out of our time in Romania, and a lot of fond memories and some weird ones too. I want to like fast forward a little bit, because of course the book comes out and 1897, right? So Bram, during this time, he's still largely known as Irving's assistant, and it's not like his life was suddenly silver spoon, gold plated after releasing this book. He's not necessarily, and then he dies in 1912, correct?
Yeah.
So when he goes, let's kind of set the stage for the Stoker family at this point. What is now going on? I mean, his widow, Florence, super wealthy widow of a famed author.
Not quite.
Not quite.
Let's set the stage here, so to speak. So 27 years he manages the Lyceum Theater with Irving. He helps Irving become the first actor ever knighted. Bram gets a lot of credit for it, but he doesn't get a pension, and he doesn't get any inheritance from Irving. He was paid well during his time, but he had to live well to hold up his end, so to speak, and keep Florence and the son well educated and so on. But Bram had sort of when Irving died in 05, Bram had a kind of a sad decline for the 7 years of health. His health began to go. He had a stroke. He wrote The Lair of the White Worm on his deathbed, essentially. And if you've ever read it, it's kind of a little disjointed, but it's really strange and interesting. But he did this as a favor to his publisher, to try to, the publisher's trying to squeeze one more winner out of him. Dracula had a decent run. It wasn't out of print. It sold its first 30,000 copies, but it wasn't making Bram a lot of money. Authors weren't making a lot of money. Bram had the sense, though, a week before the book came out in 1897, to actually, because he was a theater manager, he knew this stuff, because he had a legal background from his days in Dublin, to protect the dramatic rights of Dracula by having a staged reading. And what that means, and it's pretty cool, Aaron, because the script, one and only script, sits in the British Museum Library. Bram cut and pasted 2 advanced reader copies of Dracula and pasted them onto pages and put some handwritten notes in, had 8 of his friends from the theater, and they were not all actors, they were stagehands and so on, just simply pass the script around and read the darn thing. It took about 8 hours. And, the urban legend is Henry Irving got up after watching 20 minutes and said, dreadful, and walked out. And this is one of the things that bugs me, Aaron, I'll share it with your guys, is everybody assumes that when Irving said dreadful, I mean, it was terrible story. But doesn't it potentially mean that it was boring because it looked like it's going to be 8 hours, or it was full of dread?
Yeah, it was scary. It was terrifying.
Exactly. So, one or two biographers say, Henry Irving hated it because he was jealous that Bram was, written a successful book and so on. But maybe not. Who knows? We don't know for sure. But what that did was set the stage for Bram leaving things behind for his wife to profit from, because he knew he didn't leave her a lot of money. He actually had to take a loan from from an author society that Hall Caine helped him get to sort of round out his years. And then Bram's older brother, Sir William Thornley Stoker, a very famous doctor who was actually helped Bram with all the medical parts of Dracula, he left Florence. He died 3 months later, which was really strange and unexpected. He left Florence, £2,000, which in those days was a lot of money. So she was okay, but she certainly wasn't making a lot of money of any of the residuals of anything. But what sort of began to happen was she started looking at, can I get this thing turned into a stage play? And she obviously had contacts, and she tried, and she had a false start with a guy called Morell, but then she kind of hit pay dirt with a fellow Irishman, Hamilton Dean, and that sort of started the ball rolling to adapting the story to the stage, which brings it to a wider audience, which then stimulates book sales down the road. And of course, we'll get into film in a moment. But that was, they had a son who was now a chartered accountant. He was a wonderful guy, very introverted, but he knew the law. He knew what his father did as far as the paperwork on all of his copyrights and so on, and making sure all the T's are crossed, and he kept track of the foreign royalties and so on. But he didn't lead the charge. It was Florence who was tougher than nails to make sure that when it was time to move forward on these contracts and things, she made sure it was done right.
Just as an aside, one of the stories, perhaps it's just legend, is that, but it's worth noting, and you can speak to this better, but Bram was a very analytically minded person, or very detail oriented, to the point that, if I recall, that he was even invited to become a lawyer. And
called to the bar. It's called it, like they didn't have law school in the days. You're called to the bar, and then you write an exam, and if you pass it, then you can function as a lawyer. So he was called to the bar, but he said, no, thank you. I'm going to stick with managing the theater.
So he was on top of things. One of the stories out there is that he failed to secure the copyright in the US, in the States.
Yeah.
Is that?
So, well, I'm glad you brought it up, because I like the opportunity to sort of, air the Stoker side of it. And I can see why there was this urban legend that he did not. And that is, when my wife and I got into this whole thing in 2012 with researching and writing The Family, and Dracula the Undead had come out, and The Lost Journal was coming out, and the centenary of Bram's death. Let's try to figure out what exactly went wrong with some of these things. And one took us a while to find the right person at the Library of Congress. And what happened back in the day is, you've got to send 2 books over, and you got to make your application, you also have to, funnily enough, give away your story for free in 2 newspapers. So it's foreign writers have to then have your story published in newspapers. One was in North Carolina, the other in Chicago, and I know there were some others, so that the United States, and this happened in many countries, was sort of protecting the American authors. So you could have read Dracula for free in a North Carolina newspaper or Chicago newspaper and not have to go buy it when it finally comes out. He did that. He did send the 2 books over, because I found a lady in the Library of Congress, Margaret Wood, who actually sent us a letter saying, read my blog post, I've just done this. And she was, funnily enough, like you were, equally as perplexed. Why a man with such a legal mind and a legal background, somebody who'd write a legal manual for all the clerks of petty sessions in Ireland, why would he mess up so badly? Especially since, Aaron, he'd been to America a number of times, 8 total, with the Lyceum Theater troupe to do plays and travel around the country. He knew all the labor laws. He knew all the train schedules. He knew all the details about how to get around there, taxation and so on. So it didn't make any sense that he screwed up. And to make a long story short, they admitted that there was some kind of a filing error by filing the book Dracula under either Bram Stoker and Abraham Stoker. Bram was actually named after his father. So the fact that he used 2 different names might have messed up somebody, and the 2 books were put in different parts of Library of Congress, thus bringing up this urban legend that he did not file a copyright. And that may have had something to do with then the Nosferatu debacle, which we'll get into a while. But in fact, he did. And the family did collect royalties from Doubleday. We confirmed that by writing Doubleday a letter and said, no, absolutely, we did. So there is enough evidence now to sort of disprove one of these urban legends. And I'm glad to be able to say it on your show that Margaret Wood, thank you very much. You've righted a wrong and a misconception.
So here we are. Let's talk a little bit about Nosferatu, because, as I said, it's I think March 4th, 1922 is when it came out. This is the German expressionist film. Great film, really enjoyable horror movie, and introduced Dracula on film, and yet a unauthorized adaptation. And Florence, who was 64 when her husband died, she's trying to make a living, trying to protect her husband's legacy, try to make some money off of this book. What happens? Because the story is that this company, Prana, puts out an unauthorized adaptation, and then we go to court. Fill it in from there about what we get wrong, and set as much of the record straight as you can.
Well, it's hard to set all the records straight, but you've touched on the key notes at the moment. Florence was, when this happened, 74 years old. Her health is beginning to fail. Her eyesight's beginning to fail. She is struggling a little bit financially, but most importantly, she's struggling because a wrong has been done, and she's recognized once she got a notice. Now, we don't exactly know. Nobody does exactly know how she was aware that this film premiered in the Berlin Zoo, but somehow she did. And she then ended up going to the Incorporated Society of Authors. I do know that for a fact because I've now seen all the letters. And luckily, all those letters back and forth between Florence, the Incorporated Society of Authors, and the German lawyer that they hired are in the possession of the British Museum Library. So that's a cool record. What we don't have, because I got in touch a couple of years ago, knowing this 100th was coming up, and I wanted to learn more, just like the Library of Congress, what happened. The records in Germany are almost non-existent, and it's possible because of bombing, fires, whatever it was during World War II. There are very, very few records of the German court system back in the day. There is nothing showing Prana Films' side of the story, why they thought they could get away with it. Did they, in fact, approach Florence Stoker and say, we would like to buy a license from you? My understanding is they did not. They simply thought they could get away with it. And there is nothing in, I've looked through all the boxes that I mentioned earlier in the show about my cousins. They've got nothing. The stuff they've given away to Trinity College, there's nothing in there that shows correspondence between Prana and Florence Stoker saying we'd like to license the film. So that it doesn't seem to be any attempt to ask for a license or permission. They simply put in the opening credits and the promotional material freely adapted from Bram Stoker's Dracula, and then tried to get away with it.
And let me just interject for a moment for anyone out there. Okay, yes. So we are now in the 1920s. It's easy enough to think 100 years ago, copyright law was certainly different, but still existed. There was still copyright law, and you still had to secure a license to adapt a work. Now, Prana, and again, this is about nearly 9 years, I think, before the Bela Lugosi Browning Dracula came out, right? But Prana, as far as this question of whether or not they tried to seek approval, tried to seek a license, there is some precedent, some track record on their part that would suggest maybe they were just kind of going off half-cocked, thinking that they weren't going to get caught because this is not their first time doing this.
Yeah.
Right?
The digging that I've done, bentonfilms.com is a great location to go and look for some of this stuff. And I found that they freely adapted a Robert Louis Stevenson book into a movie. I don't know if that went to court. Again, no court records. And my friend over in Germany, Holger Mandel, who is a German historian and film historian, couldn't find anything there either. So, yeah, you're right. The law existed. Did these guys just think they were above the law, could get away with it? Was Dracula, not such a big hit in the day? It hadn't even hit the stage yet. Could they get away with it? Who knows? But the long and the short of it is, Florence needed help financially to have run a battle. So she had to convince first. It was like she had a battle on a number of fronts to convince the Incorporated Society of Authors in England, it was an all-male society who Bram had been a member of, you need to represent me. Well, first they said, well, the only reason you're joining is because you want us to represent you in court in Germany, which is going to be very expensive. And we're not really sure we're going to prevail because it's really hard to get money from somewhere over there. Florence somehow convinced the president to let it happen. We don't know how it did, but she did. And that's kind of cool in the letters. So she had to join for £10, and then they got a lawyer. And the letters back and forth, Aaron, are really pretty cool because it shows that the German lawyer representing the Society of Authors did everything he could to settle out of court. But Prana Films said, absolutely no, we're not interested. And a fee of £5,000 was dangled, apparently. And they said, no, not interested. So this went on for 2.5 years, this court case, running up a lot of bills, I'm sure. And there was a lot of back and forth to Florence at the time. And finally, when the court ruled in favor of the Corporate Society Authors on behalf of Florence, Prana Films waved the flag, we're bankrupt. We, nothing to pay. So it's like the Society of Authors don't get any money out of this. And make matters worse, the receivers of Prana Films file an appeal. So here are more letters saying we're going to have to now go and represent you in the appeal. And there doesn't seem to be any money worth it. Do you think we could at least get the films? And could the judge actually rule in favor of destroying the films? So here's another sort of urban legend. I don't have the exact answer because there's no exact record. Did Florence Stoker said, I want you to destroy all the films? Because the lawyer in Germany for the authors found out that there had been 5 or 6 editions of this floated around Europe as previews. So it wasn't going to be that easy just to have a settlement for the one film in Germany or have that one destroyed. The Incorporated Society of Authors realized that there was going to need to be 4 or 5 or 6 court cases in all these countries where the films were to either get them back to have them destroyed or to have settlements in each of them. So it was a nightmare. The film had already spread around. It come to America as well. And the biggest problem with the one in America, Aaron, was by this time, and again, we're fast forwarding now 2.5, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years. The stage plays have been going on and very successfully. And Balderston, John Balderston, an American producer who had teamed up with Hamilton Dean, the Irish playwright, who was working with Florence legally and licensed, they were dangling the rights from the play to Universal. And Florence was worried that, oh my gosh, if a pirated version of a film is allowed to move around and I can't stop it, why would they want to buy the license from me, Dean, and Balderston for the proper film? And that added another 2 years, and I'm sure a lot of heartache for Florence. Again, doing the right thing for the family, Bram being his legal mind, and she keeps getting one more roadblock and another. But finally, the good story is Universal did buy that one copy to get it out of circulation, and probably used it to look at it to, try to get something out of it for their own purposes, but mostly to get it off the market. And Florence did end up making a nice payday of $40,000, which in those days was a lot of money. So at the end of the day, in the 100th anniversary of the film, the 125th of Dracula, we can say, yeah, the film has survived, and the rights have been, the wrongs have been righted. Florence got her settlement. The precedent, as you mentioned, Aaron, at the beginning of the show, has been set for artists and musicians and writers. So it's a pretty good, happy ending of the story if it wasn't brutal for poor Florence during that 7-year stretch.
Do you think Florence, who by the time this is resolved, we're now talking about a woman that's, right at pretty much 80 years old, right? Close to it. Do you think that the legacy of Florence is that she's been maligned as some sort of artistic villain, or has she gotten a bad rap?
I think so. And that's what kind of irritates the heck out of me is when I look at all these, especially there's a lot of reviews now because the film is being shown, it's been remastered, it's been new intertitles and music. People say, oh, it almost didn't survive because that horrible Florence Stoker almost squashed it. It was really the German courts that were going to have it destroyed because Prana did something illegal. She does get a bad rap. And I have seen a couple of, for instance, in the Irish Times recently, Derek Scully contacted me and wanted my opinion. And I didn't have to give him much because he was all on the Florence side too, saying, now, wait just a sec. Even though this sort of, the precedent was set in Germany, he said it's a symbolic precedent, but every single filmmaker, artist should look back and go, this probably was the first novel to film copyright infringement that set a precedent way back in 1922, because the films were just getting started then. So they have Florence Stoker. Thank you for fighting that battle. Thank you for the heartache that you went through. And thank you for the Incorporated Society of Authors that were convinced by Florence to hang in there and pay a boatload of money, knowing they weren't getting anything back, even to hang in there through the appeal.
Yeah,
I went to with Robert Etienne-Bassang and a lady who actually wrote a book about the stage writing of Dracula. She brought me and Robert over to the British Library, and I even saw letters from a German lawyer, the same German lawyer, after everything had been settled. And he came back and said, oh, I've just found out that Nosferatu is still being shown in Berlin. Do you want us to pursue? And I can see the letter from the Incorporated Society of Authors saying, Mrs. Stoker has gladly sold the rights to Universal. These matters out of her hands and ours as well. It was like sigh of relief that the coffers of the Incorporated Society of Authors didn't have to sustain yet another battle. And the film lives on. And you know what, Aaron? We're better for it because, as you said again yourself, it's a good movie. It's a great period piece. Probably one of the closest adaptations to Bram's book. What do you think?
Yeah, so I like the the variations that were introduced in Nosferatu, the things that live on with our lore about vampires, such as sunlight, killing the vampire, and Orlok is, well, our count, Dracula from Bram's book is somewhat suave, and Orlok is this hideous creature. But then even that visual, the aesthetic of Orlok, it continues on to this day. The idea that he doesn't actively set out to create vampires, if I recall, in Nosferatu. Also, I think the Mina character is more of a gets more of a heroic play in Nosferatu.
Yeah,
because we don't have a Van Helsing.
Like, she's the only one that kind of stands up and is able to help destroy this, rather than the Van Helsing character. You're right. And the other thing that always gets me, I mean, I am squeamish around rats. Bats, I don't know, for some reason I'm cool with them. but rats, and I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, at the time of this film in the 1920s, there was all sorts of plague connections between rats and plague that were not mysteriously, but again, science was not very well developed, really upsetting the health in Germany. So it was sort of this pestilence of rats connected to this Count Orlok creature, who actually looks like a human version of a rat.
Yeah, I think there can be, looking back on history, I think it requires a lot of nuance, and I think sometimes we lose that nuance in the 21st century. It's either completely lionizing someone or damning them, and I think there's room to do kind of look at things with a certain perspective. So I think that Prana Films seemed like they were acting with bad faith. I think I don't know, but seems like that may have been the case. But then you also have the director of Murnau. You have Max Schreck, who played Orlok. These people that were just kind of doing a job and doing a good job. And looking back with nuance after 100 years, I think is probably necessary when it comes to this movie. And yeah, I'm glad that it continues to exist, that we did not lose it.
I saw a version of it in Dublin, Ireland, in a beautiful big old Gothic church with a orchestra playing very Gothic score, and that was really cool. And so to this day, to have that, even that there is this interest for a silent film, in 2022, that still attracts a lot of attention and helps people understand what filmmaking was like back in the day. But imagine a lot of people, they want to watch really cool CGI. They want to watch lots of great music and skin and flesh and blood. But to sit back and watch this with something as creative as an orchestra doing a film score, a music score, and just appreciate what was cutting edge at the time, and it's still being relevant today, is huge.
Yeah. Well, as we wind down with our talk, and I could really talk to you for hours as a friend, and also just interviewing you about these topics, because I just absolutely love it. But for you, I think it would be a gross understatement to say that Bram Stoker and Dracula has impacted your life. But, as you're now into pretty much a decade of this, a little bit more than a decade of your research, right? As you just reflect back, how do you process the idea that you knew the name and you knew the family legacy, but this is more than a fun party fact for you? This now very much defines your life.
It does. And I didn't realize that at the beginning. It was like fairly simple. My wife, who's big into genealogy, she's Southern, and wants to, like many, let's figure out our roots. And I seem to be the only one in the family who was interested in listening to this one of my uncles. He was the last of the four alive. My father had died earlier, so his brother, who knew that Jenny and I were interested in, and he'd fax stuff down from Canada for me. Oh, you got to see this. You got to see this. And we were digging into, first of all, my great-grandfather, George Stoker, who was actually very close to Bram, and lived with him while he was going to med school, and actually invented ozone therapy. And comes from a very, his wife was a very steeped in tradition in the MacLeCuddy family in Ireland. And that kind of brought me around to, well, let's now look into the other members of the family and Bram as well. So I've come sort of by it, not directly just to get into the Dracula side. That's kind of obviously the more high profile stuff. And now, it's hard to get away from it. I will say, sort of sadly, though, in this last year, my two greatest mentors, Elizabeth Miller, who I did the Lost Journal with, she became a close friend, and was what we call the Dracula police, because she didn't let anybody get off with any sort of speculation. She passed away just about 2 months ago after a long illness. And then Robert Basang, who was a good friend of hers, the two of them actually transcribed the Dracula notes, and we did a annotated Dracula together. Robert passed away about a year ago after going into hospital for a heart attack, and he was on blood thinners, and just a freak accident going to the loo. He slipped and banged his head and had internal bleeding. So those two people were the ones that sort of held my hand and welcomed me into the club, so to speak, and working with them on books, on articles, going to conferences, meeting people through them, gave me a leg up, Aaron, because, as every bit of scholarship, you've got a club, so to speak. So once I got established there because of these two generous people, I became more accepted sort of in the popular culture side. Oh, this guy he's not just a family member who's trying to profit off his family's name. He's a guy that's done the research, that's found the Lost Journal, that's been to Transylvania, that leads tours, that's paid his dues, that's co-authored books with writers that are much better than I am, but I can provide a boatload of research. That makes me proud to say that I can hold my own, in Dracula circles, but also I'm very proud to promote Bram Stoker's legacy as one of my biggest goals is when I came into this. Why isn't Bram Stoker as well known as his creation? Why is Dracula, as you said at the top of the show, known all over the globe, and the guy that created him is not? So, like, one of the things that I'm doing in this 125th anniversary is leading a tour to go to Whitby and go to Cruden Bay, and I've got a plaque that's now just been approved by the planning department in Cruden Bay to put on the wall of the hotel to show people where Bram did his thinking, where he did his writing, where he set parts of the story. I've got now a plaque up on the mountain in a volcano in Transylvania where Hans de Roos found the map coordinates in Bram's notes, and that's where the fictional castle Dracula is. So I'm trying to be a giver and trying to help promote Bram at the same time. I got to say, I'm enjoying the ride. I love chatting with guys like you who are interested in it. When we get together at conferences, we meet all kinds of other people, as you well know, that love to talk about it. Sometimes they know a heck of a lot more about the movies than I do because I'm not a big movie buff, but they've got the passion of where it all came from. And that's what I love is hearing their passion and their interest and wanting to know more about my famous relative.
Yeah, I was going to say the hiking up the volcano. That's not something that if you were just cashing in on the name is something that you would be likely to do. You've done the research and you've literally walked the walk
and got lost in the fog. Yeah, absolutely.
and just kind of two final questions, but what has been the most surreal moment? Maybe it is going up the volcano, the most surreal moment of doing this where you're like, okay, this has now become my life, hanging out in New Orleans at a vampire convention, roaming around England and Romania. And what has been the most surreal kind of moment for you throughout this journey?
Well, there's a couple of private ones, and then there's some more public ones. So the private ones, and it just happened recently, because my wife points out to me how much money I spend on these online auctions, buying letters that Bram Stoker wrote to different people.
Yeah.
You think it's like, why should I have to buy letters? Well, obviously he's famous, and these letters, when they're signed. And I found one, Aaron, that was really interesting because it was at a time of Bram's life that I was really interested in. That is, after Irving died, what was Bram doing before he died? that sort of 7-year period. And I found this letter written from the Kilmarnock Arms Hotel in Cruden Bay, Scotland. And it's really interesting. He is writing to an American opera singer, David Bisham, who was producing an opera show in London and was asking Bram, or had asked Bram in a previous letter, would he come work for him? And Bram, in his way, is saying, I hadn't thought of still working in the theater. I'm now devoting my time to writing, but I will come for you. Here's my salary. This is what I've done with Irving. So it was somewhat autobiographical letter, but Aaron, it was also really sad to see the man who had been on top of the theatrical world with Irving and the Lyceum Theater, helping Irving get knighted, and now he's having to write to an American opera guy to work for a few months. It was like a 4 or 5 month run, just to fill a gap, to make some money, to live on, and for his wife. So that was a strange kind of, but surreal aha moment to get a glimpse into his life and his mindset by buying this letter. But the other ones, are when I go to big conferences and fan conventions, Comic Cons here and there, where I am on stage and I'm pouring my heart out and giving a presentation, and I see people in the audience, nodding their head or looking like, oh my gosh, this guy knows what he's doing. And then the questions that come in, and they're really good questions. And it means, because having been a former teacher, I know I've connected with people and that my mission is worth it. It has value, what I'm doing. It's not just entertainment. It is giving people insight. And I try to do the same in these books that I co-author. They are fictional, but it's giving people a connection to the story of Bram and this incredible Dracula story that means so much to so many people, that's been adapted to stage, to film, to big screen, little screen, so many things throughout the world. And Bram Stoker plays a small but significant role, and I do the same to try to promote who this man was, what was his backstory, to put him in a position to change the world.
Yeah.
And I'm just happy doing it, and I love it.
Yeah, literally introducing something that changed the world, and that is it's an amazing thing. And speaking of fan events, I know you and I will be seeing each other in August at Michigan Paracon. Looking forward to that. That's a great event. I'm excited for you to be there. I think you're really going to enjoy it. I've been a couple times now. But beyond that, as I let you go, tell me what you have in the works, what projects you're working on, and how can people track you and check you out on the road as well.
Well, I guess the first thing is bramstokerstate.com is the website that my wife and I run. And we put a lot of information about Bram and the rest of the family on there. I have a website that I don't keep up as much as I should, dacrestoker.com. Facebook page, I do a lot, and I post a lot of things there about what different conventions I'm going to, where my appearances are. I'm going to be in New Orleans in the end of April. Actually, you mentioned that, at the Vampire Cafe, doing sort of a dinner theater talk while people are eating vampire-themed food. I'm going to be talking about Bram's life and his research and writing of Dracula. And then at Potions, it's just a speakeasy in the back edges of the French district, doing some readings from Dracula, some things that I learned while writing the annotated Dracula with Robert Bassang, highlighting stuff that was taken out of the Dracula novel in the typescript. So those hidden little Easter eggs that, and there's plenty of them, that Bram was either asked to take out or he took out, that like the original ending on a volcano, and so on and so forth. But follow me on social media, Instagram, Facebook, and you'll see some of the cool stuff I'm doing. And Aaron, I think we're going to have to sit back and have a cold beer up in Michigan in August, because it'll probably be hot there. But I think our topics will be hotter too, don't you think?
I think so. And we'll also just say, watch this space as far as additional news that you'll be rolling out about some projects, right? So,
absolutely.
And keep an eye on your social media. You've got some fun things to announce, and we'll just kind of keep our eyes peeled for that. But my friend, Dacre,
let me say one thing, because you told me to say this. All the cool stuff about Nosferatu will be coming out later on in Scream magazine.
Yep. Yes.
That's an article that is very in depth of what Aaron and I chatted about. And then also the annotated Dracula coming out. I'm not allowed to mention the name of the publisher just yet, but it's going to be coming out soon with a lot of cool insight. So Aaron, again, thank you for taking the time and the great questions and the in-depth interview that you've given. It's always a pleasure to chat with you, man.
Thank you, my friend. And thanks for everyone out there. Thank you for joining. Don't forget to subscribe. Please give me a follow on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, on Patreon, and also at Talk Strange Pod on Twitter. You can watch our interviews, our Talking Strange interviews at youtube.com/Den of Geek, and download Talking Strange every week on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Until next time, be kind, stay spooky, and keep it weird.